Welcome to day 3 of our Textile Design Spring Speaker Series. I know people are just coming in now from the waiting room, so we're going to give it just a moment. I'm Marcia Weiss. I'm the director of the Textile Design Programs at Thomas Jefferson University, and we're very happy to have all of you joining us today. We have some of our current students, some prospective students, some of our alums are with us, and some of our industry partners are joining us today. So thank you and welcome. Very happy to have you. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Kelly Chaido. Kelly is an alum of our Textile Design Program, a very accomplished designer, and she's going to speak today on creative ideation.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today. Just to give you a little bit of a background, I went to Textile a long time ago and studied weaving was my concentration, so textile design. I wish that I was a better print designer, but unfortunately I wasn't, nor was I that great at knitting. But part of what I learned the most from textiles was how to tell a story. So that's essentially what started my career. I built my career primarily at Anthropologie, and at Anthropologie started their concept and trend team. I then have gone on and worked for various brands, J. Crew, Kate Spade, Amazon, Athleta. I could go on and on, but essentially I went from the beginning of the product cycle and how to tell the story to the end of the product cycle, working with marketing teams and doing art directions, styling catalogs and campaigns. And so today I am here to discuss with you how an idea relates to end use and kind of part of that process. So I am going to begin with sharing my screen, and we begin creative ideation. So in creative ideation, it's kind of where do ideas and inspiration come from? And so as you can see from this overview, it's a lot about culture. I mean, for me, the biggest part is really understanding the culture of today and the cultures of past and the cultures of where we're headed, and not being attached to outcomes on them, but to really be always a student and always learning and always absorbing, because no one should create in a silo. And so you should always be understanding what's happening around you and how you're perceiving it and taking it and doing something good with it. So here we have a bit of Polaroid film. We also have a Dieter Rams Braun appliance, and then an Apple iPod, and how some of those same design principles were looked at for inspiration and then translated into modern design. Under that, we have a Kanye West Sunday service performance and a James Turrell light installation, some different fashion editorials, as well as window displays, some street graffiti from and advertisements from New York from last week. This really sweet note that this little girl put in a window in New York, all about the good people of New York, that the earth is going to have a deadline. So really paying attention to sustainability as well is such an important part of the idea process, and we'll go into that later on. So I will get started. Trend and culture is kind of how we'll begin. We'll go trend and culture into storytelling, forecasters, responsible design, and then what is next. So in trend and culture, creativity is derived from experience. So it's really looking at traditionally when I've done concepting and trend forecasting, it's been looking at art exhibitions, traveling, looking at global artisans, and following the news. So we'll start art exhibitions. This was an exhibition I went to pre-pandemic, Tim Walker's Wonderful Things at the V&A. And it was based off of Tim Walker. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with him, but he's an amazing photographer, and it was celebrating his imagination and creative process over the past 25 years. So I was looking at how he translated just an old fairy tale, Alice in Wonderland, and taking modern clothing and then recreating it as a modern fantasy. There's also an artist in residence program happening in the Studio Museum in Harlem, and it's looking at new media, performance, and painting. The collaborative exhibition enacts a radical intimacy So it's really looking at how different performance art and different art forms affect each other to then inspire other new works or ways of thinking. There's the tape in the bottom right-hand corner, which, because of COVID and museums in England not being able to have people inside of them, how to take artworks and put them outside, and looking at different ways of translating what was an exhibition indoors and making that an outdoor experience. Travel. So for me, travel has always been huge, and travel, exploring cities as well as the natural world. I think everyone should go out and go for a hike, and even if that hike is to a local park, it's something just to look at trees. I think in the design process, a lot of times people say nature, but nature comes in so many different colors and forms and ways and textures. And really, it should create a sensory experience for you. So it's really not everything's green, not everything's brown. Things can be all different colors, hot pink. And if you look at a lot of foliage in different countries and whatnot, nature has many forms and colors. The global market, so exploring tastes and smells is sensory experience all over the world. Every time I travel, I take a cooking class, because I think when you travel to different countries, part of what you should take in is the sensory experience. It's not just what you're seeing, but it's what you're tasting, what you're smelling, what you're feeling, all of the things, which I think help inform you when you go to create an experience for others to take in. The two magazines, Atmos and YOLO. So Atmos is an exploration of climate and culture, a biannual magazine curated by a growing ecosystem of adventurers, creatives, and journalists dedicated to pioneering progress around the world. So these are different ones talking about climate change, resource depletion, regeneration, gene editing, cellular agriculture. So essentially, being a designer and looking at inspiration, it's looking at what's happening around you and not turning a blind eye to things that may be uncomfortable to face or things that need to be addressed as well. The Yellow magazine, this woman started it because she was passionate about photography, travel, collecting great ideas, platform where photographers can share images to places a lot of people can't go or see. So it's kind of traveling through someone else's lens, and then traveling to different places that maybe you wouldn't go to, Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, to really think about what is happening there and how people are affected and what different natural resources are being used and how they're being used. Global artisans. This is really looking at, when I was in Fez, going to the tanneries, understanding the process of dyes, and in Morocco, the natural dye houses in Marrakesh for different yarns, understanding different cultures and how they do natural processes as well as artificial processes. The bottom right are some Berber rugs, and traditionally Berber women weave and storytell their experience and their stories through their rugs. So it's a whole different way of understanding how someone translates their stories and their ideas through their artwork. So I think it's not about appropriating how they do things, but it's about understanding what their experience is, and then understanding your experience from that and how that translates and what your story is to tell after that. And news, one of my favorite things to look at, because if you're not aware of what's going on around you, how do you create anything for what's going around you? So political issues, there's been so much unrest with the protests and everything. So understanding what are people upset about? What are things that are issues or which inspire you? You know, you'll make maybe different choices about what kind of yarn you use or what kind of dye process you do for how it will affect the earth. There's so many different issues, but I think paying attention to politically what's happening. I remember going to a TED Talk once with Albert Abez, the previous designer for Lanvin, and he spoke about how he would always watch the news when he was designing, so he understood what kind of mood people were in, for what kind of color they'd want to wear, how tight they'd want their clothing to be, or how loose they'd want it to be, just so that you can understand the emotional temperament to then design from there. Art and Unrest is on right now at NYU, and it's all about protesting in the pandemic and how fashion and textiles relate to that. Daily life and social relationships have been defined and enhanced by clothing in the unprecedented ways as citizens responded to competing calls to action. So it's really looking at how those issues are affecting the design process and what people are consciously making right now. And social media, more than ever, pushed to online and viral news sources becoming marketing devices. So is your news marketing to you, or is it giving you pertinent information? So much is done online and so much is pulled from different things. I mean, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, all of those are creating more content and generating more stories and different types of shows and movies and Apple TV. There's also starting to be a push towards a new social media, which is audio based. So different chat room audio ways of being inclusive for people to come and share their stories and their experiences that aren't as visual. So then how do you take that audio experience and make that a visual representation? Which brings me to storytelling. So creativity has many stories, histories of things, photography, artistry, and sensory experiences. So this is an exhibition about handbags at the V&A, so history of an object, bags inside and out. And it's looking at what was the history of time and place of an object, why was it useful and how was it used, how the aesthetics pertained with form and function to that object, and who carried it, what was it used. So there's always a story behind everything, which makes it relevant and why it should exist. So really looking at different art forms through generations, always giving history a nod, but then not staying stuck or just repeating history, but moving it forward. Photography, this is by a photographer from Mali in the 1960s, Sudu Kitao, and another one, Malik Sadib, who the two of them in the 60s were really gained a lot of notoriety for their Black and white studies of popular culture in Mali. And they would just always photograph these amazing prints, and the way in which the styling and the photography and the subject of who they were choosing gave a lot to culture and to really look at and appreciate. So there's also Slim Aarons, the American photographer noted for his images of socialites, jet setters, and celebrities. Again, another photographer who in all these were all just documentary photographers. They were documenting time, place, style, the color, the way in which light was hitting things, and tone, value, and the way it was captured in time. Lee Miller, another American photographer, she was the lover of Man Ray. So a lot of her work was surrealist and kind of lended to that. She also was good friends with Pablo Picasso and really built her reputation as a photographer in World War II. And the way in which she took surrealism and very heavy subjects and merged them. And then Deborah Turperville, who was also an American photographer, most known for her role in shifting the style of fashion photography from traditional well-lit images to broody and dreamy style, really adding emotion to photography and not making it so perfect or so upbeat, but giving it that it didn't have to be perfect, and which allowed for different ways of looking at light and shape and in clothing and fabrics. And then the modern day version of that right now would be street style photographers. So really looking again at cultural significance of people's style now and how they're dressing themselves to be relevant in everything happening around them today. sensory. And this is one of my favorites. I know that Kanye West can be quite controversial, but what he does with his Sunday service with the James Trail Light Show is he speaks a lot about mental health and light therapy. And his lights turn you into a Zen state. The way Terrell cultivates color, it's almost as if it's emanating not from you, but within you. Resonates in a uniquely profound way for West. So when and if any of you decide to look at a YouTube from one of his Sunday services, it's actually the way, and he also did a talk with David Letterman all about how different vibrations can make you feel at peace and how those sensory things can affect you in ways to make you feel differently when you're creating. Artistry, different artists that have also had a big impact on things and not always just one solo way. So Nick Cave, who became widely acclaimed for his exuberant sound suits, wearable sculptural forms based on the human body, composed out of vibrant assortment of secondhand materials. They're meant for motion. And the best part of it is that you don't know who's underneath of there. It could be any being, and it doesn't, you're just there for the performance and the pageantry of it and the joy. Everything is made out of reusable materials. So he's really great at repurposing things and sustainability. And then we have Pablo Picasso, who not only was a painter, but a sculptor and also printmaker. So it's great to look at how he was able to work in different ways of mediums from 2D to 3D in very eccentric ways. Bauhaus, design principles from Germany, architecture, and then the Annie Albers, which I'm sure a lot of you are quite familiar with. And then Georgia O'Keeffe. The best thing about Georgia O'Keeffe are so many things. The fact that she was the wife of a famous photographer to then become, at that time in the 40s and 50s, so much of her own voice was quite incredible, known not only for her paintings, but her sculptures and her style. And what I loved about her was I found I could say things with color and shapes that I couldn't say any other ways, things I had no words for. So the way that she used her own self-expression through her art is really inspiring, and that it doesn't have to look one way in how you're inspired and what you do with it. Which brings us to the forecasters. So once you've done all of these things, creativity is subjective, and you've collected your worldly experience in whichever ways, through your computer or through walking outside of your door. What do you do with it, and what trends do you come up with? So WGSN is a global trend authority for fashion and creative industries, and they create these different reports based on color or textures, fabrics, silhouettes, who and what they think a consumer will want and what their mindset is, and what's trending. So again, it's a subjective coalition of what they think that people are responding to and what they think culture is. Trend Union is another one that does this. By Lee Eldecor. It's been around for quite a while, and they do a similar platform of consultancy for different brands, as well as pulling inspiration and color palettes. They look a lot at the news. They're very based in a lot of what's happening, not just from an artistic level or a styling level. They really want to look a little bit more esoteric at things, and then make their choices based off of that. And then Trendstop, which is a UK-based trend service, who's a little bit more brand heavy in wanting to really work with brands to figure out what their values and opportunities are, and their forecasts, and what's really specific to different brands coming to them and how they're translating what's happening out there in the world. Responsible design. So For me, responsible design is creativity is a response to problem solving. So really, what are you doing with all of these things that are being created? So investment, upcycling, authenticity, and intentional design. Net-a-Porter and Ukes have been one of the biggest leaders in this right now, where they have a whole initiative all about people positive, planet positive, circular business, circular culture, transparency and collaboration, and how everything works together. They just launched their 10-year sustainability strategy. They're understanding and creatively problem solving for the beginning of a product life cycle, the importance of sustainable responsibility. So they begin with the impossible. They look to the future. What kind of world do we want to create? It's time to transform the way fashion is made, sold, and used, to stand behind quality craftsmanship, designed well, designed to last, designed to be loved, and remade technology and data, an inclusive world, the next generation, a business ecosystem, and to put our planet in balance. A circular future isn't here yet. We will shape it. Fashion, love for a lifetime, and beyond. And Net-a-Porter has been one of the leaders in luxury fashion who's actually standing behind their whole net sustain principle and program, where they are trying to really help emerging designers that are being responsible designers and trying to promote them and give a luxury voice to that which we should all be paying attention to. Hermès is another incredible, incredible leader. They've started the Hermès Foundation, and they're really looking at who they employ for their craftsmen people. They're trying to train them, pass on, develop, ensure well-being, health, and solidarity, so that people are not dispendable, but they are actually invested in. They're also investing in the planet and how they're using resources and what they're doing with them. And the communities, they're not just taking from people's communities, they're also replenishing them to give sustainability a real voice and a lot of authenticity, so that it's not just a buzzword. So they have the artisans that they work with, the global impact. They've really partnered with a lot of different organizations in the United Nations to really work on programs that will keep purpose in their product and not just take, which is huge in the idea phase, because it takes ideas to make changes that have already been put and implemented in certain design ways. And Hermès maintains to still be a leader in the design world, as well as incorporating all of these. Upcycling. So upcycling for brands as well as retailers. The Real has Make Well, Buy Well, Resell. And just a little snip from their site: the pandemic has a lasting impact on the resale market, a mindset shifting towards investing in and living by what we truly value. So there is a thought when you are designing and are being inspired, what are you making to last a lifetime? Because there is no way. So what are you really being conscious about when you're designing to create something beautiful that will last, instead of just something that's trend driven for a moment, or 100 blue sweaters that are all saying the same thing. Depop is another one that really is all about influencers, and they're changing the game of how vintage and upcycling is a community-based, inclusive activity and place. The image on the left is a Depop pop-up in Selfridges. So they're making a statement, and larger retailers as well, is that fashion, just because it had a cycle, isn't done. You can bring it back and make it really new and interesting and trendy in something that maybe didn't seem that way. And then Selfridges also did a whole collaboration with Oxfam, which in the UK is kind of like a Goodwill of the US, and worked with stylists. And so the Oxfam could say this is a trend, secondhand is a trend, you can recreate it, it can have a new voice. And they did Secondhand September, which is, think of it as a dry January for clothes addicts. Hopes that the campaign, now in its second year, will establish itself on the calendar in the same way. In normal times, September is the month when summer dresses are packed away and the trend cycle reboots, hence those hefty September issues of the glossy magazines full of new look wish lists. So this is really a challenge to how can you restyle, reuse, and not just throw away. Authenticity is another big one when designing. So this is a Dieter Rams design, and he's one of my favorites because he has this 10 design principle. Good design is innovative, good design makes a product useful, good design is aesthetic, good design makes a product understandable, good design is unobtrusive, good design is honest, good design is long-lasting, good design is thorough down to the last detail, good design is environmentally friendly, and good design is as little design as possible. And if you look at most of his designs, they are as relevant as they were in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to now. And a lot of Apple products are actually based off of those initial design motifs or thoughts and principles. So he says the more expressive a design is, the narrower its natural environment is likely to be. And the sooner you tire of it, the simpler design, the longer it's able to serve its owner as intended. While other designers and architects were busy stamping their identity on buildings and products, Rams was trying to remove ego entirely from the process. He designed not for himself, but to serve others. And I think at designers in this day and age, it is really important that it shouldn't be an ego-based I created. It should be what is relevant, what is intentional, what is authentic and honest, that has purpose in being. Which brings us to intentional. Waste at the end of the day is a design flaw. It doesn't exist in nature. So Marnie did this pop folk market where they took recycled materials and recreated them into products, working with Colombian artisans so that they could actually build community as well as reusing resources. Hermes Petite H is a whole project that Hermes really believes that just because a bag was cut from one part of a skin, that the rest of the skin is not just as beautiful or just as valuable. So they take scraps of scarves and leather pieces and recreate them for one-of-a-kind pieces so that the actual textiles and other materials used are always held in the same level of respect and beauty and remade into really even more beautiful objects that are one of a kind. They had, before the pre-pandemic, in their stores, they would do different items depending on where you were in the world that celebrated the culture of that Hermes store and the cast off materials left over. Rentrage is another newer design brand. They believe that every piece of clothing, old, used, vintage, or new, has value, beauty, and purpose, meant to dress the creative, strong, determined women who will carry us into the future. So everything is repurposed materials into one-of-a-kind or limited edition. There's a whole load of new designers that are really looking at different ways of doing this. So it makes the initial production of that floral print just as important to make sure it's just as beautiful in the initial production. And then what is next? So thinking about where we're headed next in storytelling and where we'll find our ideas, there's a lot of virtual reality, and there's different shows, Years and Years or Euphoria, or different shows that highlight where we're headed from a technology standpoint. So how will storytelling change from then, and where will ideas come from? There was a virtual reality show for Topshop, digital clothing created by Carling's, virtual clothing made by them as well, augmented reality. within a decade, people could regularly wear high-tech glasses that can apply digital effects over what the wearer sees in real life. Predicting that, meaning virtual clothes will no longer be restricted to a computer or a phone screen. So it will be an interesting dynamic of what happens natural versus the virtual world as we go forward. So we shall see. I will leave us with thoughts of where we're headed next. And thank you all for taking the time to let me share my thoughts on ideas. Thank you.
Kelly, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. So, of course, in this year, it's impossible to not talk about the pandemic. And you have talked about this a bit in terms of the experience with travel and the ability to even go outside and take a hike. If we can't get on a plane right now and go somewhere, but how do you see this idea of storytelling and the ideation process changing now during the pandemic and sort of post-pandemic versus what it was before?
I think there will be a lot more, again, authenticity, which I know can be a bit of a buzzword. I think people are constantly searching for content, especially in the fashion industry. Everybody's always looking for content, but what that content pertains to or what it has, I think people will become more selective in what they're following or what they're looking for. And so I think it may not just be about getting on Instagram and following somebody with 200,000 likes. There's a whole documentary called Fake Famous. I don't know if anybody has watched it yet, on HBO. And it's where this reporter essentially took all these people and said, we're just going to take 3 random people and make them Instagram famous. And we're going to buy all the likes and buy all the followers and buy all of this, which then takes away from who's really a leader in inspiration or culture. So I think there will be a lot more authenticity, and I think people will search out maybe in different ways. I know it's a little harder when you can't go down the street, but I think people will spend more time on the internet, but maybe look for different sources and where they're finding their information on the internet. Maybe sitting in, watching more PBS or listening to NPR, or really turning on a radio and letting whatever hits the airwaves versus what Spotify is telling you that you need to listen to.
It's an interesting point because we simultaneously have so much more access to everything now that we're mostly not traveling, and at the same time, we don't have the kind of access that we were accustomed to. And I know you are also a global nomad. You've traveled extensively, and so one of the questions that it raises is, when we think about creating sensory experiences, we as textile designers are inherently tactile people. So how do we replicate that in a digital environment? How do we find the balance or even the substitution that comes close to, we joke that when we say, may I see that, it means hand it to me, because we want to touch the goods. So what are your thoughts on how that can be managed in our current digital environment?
I think there will be more video. I think motion can detect more light. I think it will also give a way which will give something shape that a 3D experience will give that a 2D does not. I know when I go to buy something online, if I go to buy a blouse or something, I'm constantly hitting the video button to see how it moves. Versus just looking at something 2-dimensionally. So I think video, and that's why I do think VR is going to be incredibly important going forward, because I think people will virtually connect to 3-dimensional experiences when they can't physically be there.
And that leads into the next question that came in. With the onset of all of the digital goods, do you see any trends that go back to basics, such as analog experiences or physical items that completely deny a digital experience?
Yes and no. So working in the photo industry, especially, everybody's doing film again, and or they're hiring cameras that look like film or adding effects that look like film, but they're really digital experiences. So even Polaroid cameras have made such a wonderful return, which is always great when the light hits it or you have an exposed leak of something. That's a happy mistake. But I think that it will be in balance. I don't think anybody will go purely analog. And I do think the more that people, so some of the work that I've done with past clients, smaller clients in branding, sustainability is such a buzzword and everybody wants to be sustainable, but they're not being responsible. And I think that's a really big difference in the two, is that what is sustainability? Because sustainability wouldn't be starting another brand. It wouldn't be saying, unless there's something really that nobody's ever seen, but that's technology right now. So sustainability and creating just to create is for me a difficult one. I think it's more about responsibility. So I think some analog process may, but then that butts up against the sustainable factor. It's a tricky balance of where things will go, because you do one to preserve and then it takes away from the other. So.
And I think you're right. The word balance that you just used, I think that's really what we're all striving to find, because certainly prior to the pandemic, I think many of us could argue that certain aspects of design and of the textile and fashion industries were out of balance, and the pendulum has swung significantly in the last year. And I think we're all trying to find our equilibrium with all of that. So how do you see the sustainable initiatives developing across different price point levels in the market? I think that's a great question, because so much of what we talk about in terms of sustainable initiatives, one can envision how they were managed at, say, a higher price point, but how do you see it spreading across the price point levels?
So for me, I think a lot of that upcycling is helping on the lower levels of things, because people aren't having to produce a certain amount of yardage that cost a certain amount of money, or dye techniques or dye lots or this or that. So I think that's partly why a lot of these smaller brands have started doing these upcycling and recrafting processes. And then I think too, I will say I have a friend who has her own brand, and she's doing as much as she can for sustainability and natural dyes and working with indigenous weavers and things of that nature, but it's incredibly expensive, and her product has to be that for her to pay them adequate wages so that they can. So I think it's a lot harder for smaller brands. I think because the price point just doesn't support it. And so I think to a detriment, I think the more that things start shifting that way with bigger brands that pave the way for smaller brands, I think that it'll start, because then if everything is being made with a certain type of dye process or sustainable farming or manufacturing, then it's already put in place by somebody who's kind of paying it forward for smaller brands to start doing it.
I think there's some amount of re-education that goes into that as well. I mean, and perhaps from your experience, you could comment on this. In the U.S. And perhaps in most of Western society, we're accustomed to being able to go and purchase that $5 T-shirt or whatever, because we want it, because it's a great color, because the cut is gorgeous, because I see it today and I want it. And we have gotten very accustomed to the fact that we can get some things that might be trendy or stylish for next to nothing, really, truly, in terms of the cost. Do you think that that's unique to the US? Like, are there other cultures that you have witnessed that value the making process more, where people value the goods, value their apparel items or their fashion items or even their home accessories, and understand that the price that they're paying is appropriate and worthwhile?
That's a wonderful question. I'm trying to think of where I've traveled in the world and the different nuances. I mean, I would say I think that the storytelling and thoughtfulness in the production is probably the most different that I've seen across countries and cultures. And I think the actual upfront of the creating process has been very different in different cultures, and how people are. There's a designer in the UK, Bethany Wilson, and she hires incarcerated people to help her, or just out of jail to help her make her garments. So she's starting to build community within her to pay people equal wages and kind of pay karmically forward and society. So there's, I think it's sustainability in different and new ways in which they're creating clothing or accessories or homewares. When I've traveled to Morocco and Istanbul and all of those places, and you see all of the textiles in India, it's interesting because India for me was one of the most expensive places for textiles I've ever been. And I was under this notion that everything would be really inexpensive, and went there like, I'm going to buy everything. And it was actually really expensive. And it made me appreciate it when I could actually understand if it was going to someone, but part of that had built in a middleman who was actually taking a generous cut of a lot of those things. And they would create these workshops that you would go in, and they were like tourist attractions where, oh, see them block print, see them make a rug, and it just wasn't ethical or responsible. And so then you wonder, why am I paying all this money if it's not really reaching the artisans that are creating and working so hard on these things? I'm not sure that answered your question, but that's kind of some of the ways in which I've seen where I think value for what you're actually purchasing makes sense or not make sense.
It is interesting hearing the comments about India, because I also would have entered it with that same thought process that things will be inexpensive and I can come back with really beautiful textiles. So, and I had a short story. I had almost the opposite happen when I was in West Africa. We were offered some textiles at what were honestly too low prices. Like, it was embarrassingly low. And we said, no, we can't just pay that, we'll pay this. So, I mean, I do think it varies a lot culture to culture. Okay, back to questions from our audience. How have your workflow and the timelines associated with work cycles changed due to the pandemic? So have things gone faster, slower? What has that process been like?
It's definitely been one of those moments to be flexible, because everything, when it first hit, everything was put on hold. Deliveries, orders are being canceled. The design process, are we designing a new season? Are we not? We still have all of this other things already in production or canceled or this or that. I would say now things have gotten back on track. And some of my clients, it didn't really skip a beat too much. So other ones, it did. I also work in the photo industry, so that took a really long break, which is when everyone was sending everything to influencers and models at home. I mean, Zara sent all of their products for models to shoot on themselves at home during the first beginning of the pandemic. That's now changed. People are traveling a bit more. They're social distancing. I mean, every time you land, you have a COVID test, your temperature is checked every day, you're 6 feet away from everyone, you have a PPP supervisor, COVID on set with you, making sure that everyone's adhering to all guidelines. So it's been, I probably have seen more difference in that world than in the design world.
Well, and it's really promising to hear that you're seeing some things, I don't want to say come back in fashion, but that because certainly what we have heard through the news is that home furnishings, because many of us have been trapped at home for an extended period of time. So the home furnishings industry has been really booming for the last year-ish, and that fashion has taken a much heavier hit. So it's promising to hear that although some of your clients maybe took a little bit of a breather, for others maybe there wasn't really a dramatic change.
Yeah.
So, So you shared some different trend forecasts or forecasting agencies.
Mhm.
Do you follow any of these?
No, I do not.
Okay.
I know a majority of industry companies, bigger retailers do. And I think a lot of them use it as a checks and balance of, oh, did we get the trend right? Are we on track for, if we're going to invest in this color and this shape and this trend, is it going to bring us the results that we want? But personally for me, I worry that if everyone follows the same point of view, then everything looks the same. And you could go to Burberry or Target and buy the same blue sweater because it was forecasted by the same person. So I think, again, all the agencies have little small nuances, but if everyone follows the same guidance or uses it directly as that is the only thing they're using to sort out what their trend is, I worry about that. So I personally do not, but I understand the validity and why companies use it.
Well, and to the point that using it as a check and balance, I think that's a brilliant way to think about that. And certainly in my corporate life, we subscribe to quite a number of services and use those in addition to what the styling team would pull together. I loved the comment you said at the beginning about design does not happen in a silo. Can you talk a little bit about how important collaboration and feedback is to good design?
It is imperative. I do not think anyone should ever work in a silo, because if you can, you're not only creating for yourself, you're creating for others, you would hope. And yes, you have a vision and a voice, but it's just like in any relationship, you have to be willing to listen and appreciate what others think and feel. So the one thing I will say that is imperative for any designer is collaboration and being willing to work together and to hear people, because you may miss something that, we all are exposed to so much and you're not exposed to it all, is the way that I always look personally for myself. So I love when I can watch a movie or read an article and someone tells me something new, and then we can have a talk about it, or like new ideas, and then something else generates from that you didn't even think of. So I'm huge on collaboration. I think it definitely breathes new life into so much, and it gives new personalities and personas. So when two companies come together that maybe don't make sense together, they create something that's amazing and wouldn't have existed before.
Do you think those kinds of collaborations with two companies, do you think they are more successful when the companies have more distinct individual personalities?
Yeah. And that's one thing that I think, to your point, Marcia, is sometimes lacking in companies when they follow too much trend and they don't keep the authenticity to what their brand is and their brand guidelines and values. Because then if you follow every trend, there's no voice, there's no DNA, there's no relevancy to you existing versus another company existing. So yes, I think really understanding who you are so that you can meet someone else with who they are to create something else.
And I think that leads into a next question very directly, which is that idea of authenticity. How would you recommend our students think about that as they're developing bodies of work, as they're developing collections, as they're developing websites, portfolios, etc.?
This is huge for me because I think a lot of people don't know who they are. And I know I'm constantly trying to understand who I am, and who I was 3, 6, 9, 12 months ago is very different than who I am now. And I think you have to constantly, you can change, but understanding your baselines. So colors that resonate with you, textures that resonate with you, even line quality. I know that I like organic shapes. I don't like hard lines. If something is too pointed, it makes me actually feel uncomfortable, versus for some people or designers like a Rick Owens or something like that are very hard, very, you know, there's certain things like I'm organic versus linear. Like there's just certain things and ways that you naturally can feel when you are creating. I love a house that's completely void of color because I work so much in color. Mm-hmm. So I know for myself, I have like certain lifestyle things that I need to do because that make me just feel balanced and okay. So I think as students are building their identity, I always, when I sit down with branding clients, I always ask them to do a whole exercise with me where if you were a candle, what would you smell like? If you were a flower, what would you be? If you were this, what would you that? So it's kind of an exercise in understanding what resonates with you and what your story is and who you are, which makes you you. So I think that is super important to understand who you are as a designer, because when you go into a brand, you have to understand that the brand is a separate thing and it's not you're the designer. You can bring your level of expertise and creativity, but it's not you for the brand, it's the brand that you're designing for. So I think it's good to have a good voice of who feels right for you to work for too, that you can really, I mean, there's certain companies that I just will never be relevant to work for. And I recognize that. It doesn't mean that, you know, you should ever not apply for things, but just understanding where you're going to make the most difference and what feels naturally the best fit.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think we're going to have that as our last comment today. So Kelly, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation on creative ideation. I know I've taken many notes, and this will certainly prompt much more discussion in our studios with our students. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of our guests who've joined us this week. We're very happy to have had you for today's presentation and perhaps the last 2 days as well. Thanks so much, and go enjoy the beautiful day. Hopefully it's a beautiful day wherever everybody is. So thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.